candidate today that I'm going to introduce is Greg Orman, who earned a degree in economics from Princeton University and shortly thereafter founded a lighting systems company that began his successful career in business. Mr. Orman remains involved in several businesses throughout the country, including a firm he co-founded in 2004 to provide capital and management services to small businesses. In addition to work, Mr. Orman also active for many years in the American Legion's Boys State program. Our next candidate is Senator Pat Roberts, first elected to the U.S. Senate in 1996 after serving 8 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He is a former Marine, Senator Roberts serving as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee from 2003 to 2006 during a pivotal time in American history. He currently serves on the Senate's Agriculture, Finance, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pension committees. Welcome to both of our candidates today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to remind you to silence your cell phones. We don't mind tweeting real time. We're all about social media, but keep your phones quiet, and also yourselves. We know you'll be well behaved as we begin today's forum. Our opening statements will be 3 minutes for each candidate. We've already predetermined our order of business today. 3 minutes for each candidate, and by virtue of a coin flip, Greg Orman will lead us off with an opening statement. Mr. Orman.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here as well. I spent my summers as a teenager watching my father run his own business just 10 miles from here in what was once Stanley, Kansas. While I enjoyed spending time with my dad, the experience was really so much more than that. I learned the value of a dollar. I learned the value of hard work and treating your employees well. Most importantly, it stirred in me a desire to run my own business someday. My father once said to me, "One concrete action is better than 1,000 good ideas." So when I graduated from college, I started the first good business idea I had. With the benefit of great partners, hard work, a little luck, I was fortunate to be able to grow that business to the point where Kansas City Power and Light acquired it and asked me to run a number of their competitive businesses. I'm very proud of my private sector track record of creating jobs and opportunities for employees and value for shareholders. I'm the only candidate on this stage who's created a private sector job, who's had to deal with increasing government regulations, who knows what the burdens of runaway health care costs are doing to small businesses, and who understands the challenges of running a business and solving problems day in and day out. And I think it uniquely qualifies me to serve in the United States Senate, a body that we all know is broken. We're sending the worst of both parties to Washington, bitter partisans who care more about pleasing the extremists and the special interests in their own parties than they do about solving problems. They draw childish lines in the sand and refuse to cooperate. As a result, inaction has replaced leadership in solving our most pressing problems. And we have serious problems to solve, from health care and higher education affordability, to stagnant wages, to living within our means as a country. If we don't address these issues, our standard of living, our status in the world, and the very existence of the middle class in America is at risk. I've tried both parties, and like a lot of Kansans, I've been disappointed. This afternoon, Pat Roberts will repeatedly tell you that President Obama and Harry Reid are the reason Washington is such a mess. And you know what? He's half right. But the other half of the mess, Mitch McConnell and Pat Roberts. The truth is, both parties are more interested in playing political games than problem solving, and both parties are failing Kansas. That's why I'm running for the United States Senate as an independent. I'm a fiscally responsible businessman who believes we need to face our difficult issues head on and not hide from them because they carry with them political risk. I will focus on solutions, not party politics. And I will stand up for the best ideas, regardless of what party it comes from, because I'm more interested in solving problems than scoring political points.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, thank you, John. And thank you to the Johnson County Public Policy Council for sponsoring this event. I appreciate the chance to be with you today. Folks, America is at a crossroads. And right now, it is up to Kansas. The choice is straightforward and clear. Experience, integrity, someone who will be honest with you and tell you the good and the bad, someone guided by conservative principles. someone you know, who has worked and fought with you, who has won key battles, someone who has earned your trust, someone who has been and will continue to be your champion, or someone who tells you only what he thinks what you want to hear, someone who won't tell you where he stands, who doesn't have a foundation or a compass. Folks, my opponent will do nothing to roll back Obamacare. He will do nothing to stop Barack Obama or Harry Reid, the very people he has contributed to and voted for. In fact, a vote for Greg Orman is a vote to hand over the future of Kansas and the country to Harry Reid and Barack Obama. I have fought Reid and Obama and won. We stopped their misguided attempts to level massive fees on our general aviation industry. I have fought the EPA bureaucrats trying to strangle our energy and agriculture industries. And my record of creating real Kansas jobs was recognized this week as I earned the endorsement of the United States Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business. Do any of us really believe that my opponent would stand up to President Obama? He helped elect him. I promise you this, my first vote will be for a Republican majority. We will end the gridlock in the United States Senate. That is a vote for Kansas. My opponent cannot and will not make that same promise. Kansans believe in shooting straight and coming clean. He has done neither. He wants to run out the clock. He doesn't want to answer the tough questions. If he can't answer them here, how is he going to answer them in Washington? My friends, elections are a matter of trust. Who can you trust to represent the best interest of your business, your family, your state, and our country? I am the only candidate who has the experience, the convictions, the ability to break Harry Reid's stranglehold on the U.S. Senate and the courage to stop the Obama agenda. I have been your champion. Ladies and gentlemen, our republic, our way of life, our future is at a tipping point. Just days ago, President Obama said this election is a referendum on his record, his policies, and I would add legacy, and he was right. A vote for Greg Orman is a vote for President Obama. A vote for Pat Roberts is a vote for the Republican majority. That is a vote for jobs, for growth, for freedom, and for Kansas. Thank you.
Let's begin the questioning portion of our forum today. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the question. They'll alternate. There will be no specific rebuttal or response. The candidates have not seen the questions. They were prepared in advance by the Johnson County Public Policy Council, focusing on business-related issues. Our question first will begin with Senator Pat Roberts. The recession and continuing financial struggles, both personal and business-related, regulatory uncertainty, and the many other international challenges that exist today have shaken Americans' confidence in the economy and their own financial futures. What do you believe is the best way to go about reassuring them and restoring their faith in the country's ability to work its way out of this crisis? 2 minutes, Mr. Roberts.
Well, you've hit the nail right on the head. Into the 105 county tours and going from corner to corner and border to border in Kansas, that's the #1 issue. You can talk about Obamacare, you can talk about all sorts of different issues, but the main issue is that people have lost faith in their government. We will restore faith in government when we restore the leadership in the United States Senate. I have a record of creating real jobs and a pro-growth economy, which is why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the NFIB have endorsed me. Now, they endorsed me because of my record on the very issues that each of you have come to Washington and talked to me about, and I have come and talked to your chamber about in Kansas. Those same issues. And when the chamber looked at those issues, when the chamber looked at my record, they said, we're going to endorse you. And then they went a step farther and actually said that my opponent is a liberal Democrat. That's what they said. Not me. That's what they said after looking at our records. So basically, I have a record of creating real Kansas jobs. I am endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business, along with the Kansas Farm Bureau, all of the other farm groups, Kansas Right to Life, NRA, about 70% of the Kansas legislature on both sides, and I am very proud of those endorsements. I will be the pro-job, pro-growth, not only the candidate, but I will get things done.
Mr. Orman?
I think that we can all agree that Washington's broken, and that is definitely shaking the confidence of Kansans and business people everywhere. I've traveled throughout the state, and what I've heard in places like Harvey County and Sedgwick County is that we need to get certainty around things like transportation funding. Until we get certainty around transportation funding, they feel like they're at a standstill in terms of what they can do in those parts of the state. I've talked to folks in western Kansas who say until we get clarity around immigration policy, we're putting on hold plans to expand our facilities because we don't want to find ourselves in an environment where an overly burdensome immigration policy ends up decimating our industries. I've heard Senator Roberts talk very specifically about caring about the farm community, and yet a number of his policies would absolutely decimate agriculture in the state of Kansas. So I do think we need to get things working again in Washington. I do think we need to get to the point where businesses have confidence to take their dollars and reinvest them in the United States. One of the things that I've promoted as part of our campaign is what we refer to as our small business plan. And we've talked very specifically about a number of things that we believe we need to do to make it easier for small businesses. First and foremost, we need to relax the Dodd-Frank regulations that relate to community banks and regional banks. These weren't the banks that were responsible for bringing our financial industry to the brink of collapse. And yet, those regulations are preventing them from lending to local businesses. I've also said we need to review every regulation once every 10 years and submit it back to Congress for an up or down vote. Those are real policies that will help get our economy back on track.
Let's talk transportation with our next question, and this question will start with Mr. Orman. A safe and efficient transportation system is essential to our economy and quality of life. Transportation programs for Kansas rely in part on federal funding. States recently told that due to the low balance in the Federal Highway Trust Fund, federal transportation fund payments could be delayed and include shortfalls, leaving future of some state and local projects in doubt. What solutions would you propose to ensure the viability of the Highway Trust Fund so that federal resources are available to states to help meet transportation needs, including any new strategies that you might have? Mr. Orman?
That's a great question.
Means jobs. That's why I've worked so terribly hard for the Animal Health Corridor and for NBAF, which will really create jobs big time. This is why I'm for the pipeline. He is not for the pipeline. The pipeline would be 60,000 jobs in terms of infrastructure. But the basic problem, yes, is we have to replenish the Highway Trust Fund. Right now, it's general funding. I don't know if you could just cobble together a whole bunch of other programs and say we're going to give it to the Highway Trust Fund. I think we have to have dedicated funds over the long term that we can really rely on.
Our next question focuses on tax policy. What are your views on our national tax policy, and specifically, what would you do to improve the current system? Senator Roberts, we'll start with you.
Well, one thing for sure, you're not going to have tax reform with Harry Reid leading the Senate. That hasn't happened in the last 3 years, despite numerous hearings within the Finance Committee. So you have to change leadership right off the bat. But the tax code obviously needs to be lower, flatter, fairer. We need to lower your taxes. But that is why, again, when they took a look at tax reform and my activity with regards to tax reform, number one, I saved the aviation industry from user fees and taxes that were very ill-advised, 27,000 jobs in Wichita, $3.5 billion to the economy. So you can do that. There are ways that you don't want to pick and choose with regards to the Obama administration on who you're going to tax. But that is why I got endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business. As they go down your record, and say, what would you do for tax reform to make taxes lower, fairer, simpler, and flatter, they endorsed me. They did not endorse my opponent. And I think that he has to come clean with Kansas voters. First and Second Amendment, Keystone Pipeline, amnesty, Obamacare. It proves beyond any reasonable measure that he is a liberal Democrat by word, by deed, and by campaign donation. That's not going to help tax reform.
Mr. Orman.
You know, I've often said that we don't live in the information age anymore so much as we live in the misinformation age. And I think what you just heard from Senator Roberts is a lot of misinformation that he'd like you to believe when making your decision. The facts are Senator Roberts and I actually had the same positions on things like gun control and how to handle the immigration system. If you look at his record from years ago, he's just changed that record now because he thinks it's a better way to get elected. As it relates to the tax code, I have been pretty clear on this from the beginning. I believe the corporate tax code needs to be significantly streamlined. We need to reduce overall tax rates in the corporate tax code, and we need to move to a territorial system. A territorial system will prevent companies from completing inversions. It will take away the incentives to take jobs offshore, and ultimately is the same sort of tax code that the vast majority of our trading partners have. They've modernized their tax code for an environment that includes globalization and the internet. We have not, and as a result of it, it really hampers our businesses and our competitiveness. At the personal level, I have also said that we need to do the same thing, that we should not be using the tax code to pick winners and losers, that we should streamline the tax code, lower overall rates, and ultimately, if someone has a project that they want to spend money on, they should have to argue for that project in the light of the budgeting process and not the darkness of the tax code. And that's what we do today. We spend considerably more money in the tax code that really needs to have transparency brought to it.
Concern about domestic terrorism has certainly placed a spotlight on the security of the country's immigration and visa programs. In Kansas, for example, hundreds of H-1B visas have been issued to skilled foreign professionals to fill important high-tech jobs for which there's simply not enough qualified American workers. In the absence of an effective national policy on immigration, a lot of states are considering their own laws, which would almost certainly lead to a patchwork of policies that are inconsistent. What are your views on the interplay between the need to ensure national security and the need to import workers to fill these jobs where there is a shortage of American workers, including any changes that you would propose in U.S. law and policies toward immigration? Mr. Orman, you'll lead us off with this question.
Well, first, I'd like to make sure everyone's clear on what my immigration policy is. I have said from the beginning that I'm not a supporter of amnesty, that I don't believe people who are here on an undocumented basis should have any preferences as it relates to becoming an American citizen. With that said, what I have said about our immigration policy is that what we have today is a failure. What we have today is a demonstration of how Washington doesn't work. Both sides, Democrats and Republicans alike, have had significant periods of time when they've controlled all houses of Congress and the presidency, and neither party has done anything about it. So what do I think needs to be done about immigration? I think our policy needs to be tough, practical, and fair. By tough, I mean we need to secure the borders. Now, we've doubled the number of border security agents that we have there in the last 10 years. I think we need to keep that commitment. We need to revisit some of the technology projects that we tried 10 years ago that didn't seem to work. I think as technology has advanced, there's a more likelihood that they'll be successful. And then we need to use that to secure the border. But it also has to be practical. We are not going to find and send home 11.5 million people, nor would it be advisable. Senator, the parts of the state that you profess to care about would be absolutely decimated if that happened. The meatpacking industry, the agricultural industry, the service industry in this state would go away. So how do we make it fair to taxpayers? I think if you're here on an undocumented basis, you should have to register with ICE. You should have to pay a small fine or perform community service as an acknowledgement that you've broken a law. You should have to hold down a job, pay taxes, and obey our laws, and then I think you should be able to stay here and work.
Mr. Roberts?
My opponent says he's not for amnesty. In the last debate in Hutchinson, Kansas, he said he was for amnesty. Now, that's not shooting straight. That's not coming clean. Here's the problem with immigration. The House has sent over to the Senate a bill, a very simple bill. It says that we should treat every country like we treat Mexico and Canada. If there's an illegal immigrant, sorry, humanitarian repatriation. It's illegal, you go back. The problem was when the president, a couple of years ago, said if you're 16 and younger, you can stay. Central American countries had a flood of refugees, a humanitarian disaster. The first thing we have to do is secure the border. But that House bill has a border secure part that is really effective, and it has a change to that law. But the Senate is where good bills go to die. And Harry Reid will not allow a vote. He is using the immigration issue as a political tool. We're not going to get anywhere with immigration or all of the visa programs that we're talking about until we secure the border first. And we're not going to get anywhere unless we change that law. And we're not going to get anywhere unless we have a Republican majority in the Senate of the United States. We keep hearing about this gridlock. We will end the gridlock with a Republican majority. And this issue is pretty simple. The road to a Republican majority and to get answers and to get the Senate moving again and get them moving again on all the issues that we care about, all that the NFIB cared about, all that the Chamber cared about, is a road that runs right through Kansas. A vote for Pat Roberts is a vote for a Republican majority to end the gridlock, to consider these very difficult questions. A vote for Greg Orman is a vote to continue the Barack Obama and Harry Reid agenda.
Certainly energy affects businesses large and small. What specific views do you have on national energy policy, including authorization of the Keystone Pipeline, renewable energy standards, oil and gas exploration, and emissions control? Mr. Roberts, we'll start with you.
Well, energy is absolutely key to us. It's the economic driver. The Keystone Pipeline is an excellent suggestion. My opponent says he wants to study it. It's been studied 5 times on environmental impact studies. What we have to have is an all-of-the-above approach. But can we quit this war against fossil fuels in our oil and gas industry? We're talking about 150,000 jobs in Kansas. Can we at least stop declaring war on coal when Kansas depends 74% of its energy on coal? So I say all of the above, yes to the renewables, yes to the fossil fuels, and think what would happen if we would really open up that pipeline. We would start exporting natural gas to Europe, making Europe less dependent on Vladimir Putin. Energy, a proper energy industry to make us energy independent also helps our national security and world stability. It is that important, and it is the driver of our whole economy. Open up the pipeline, export the natural gas to Europe, quit declaring war on our oil and gas industry and our coal industries. That is what happens under the Obama administration, and that is exactly what a vote for Greg Orman would be, to hand the future of the energy industry back to Harry Reid and Barack Obama You know, just days ago, the President indicated that this whole election is about a referendum on his policies and his programs. And that's true. And that's what this referendum's all about. A vote for Greg Orman is to continue the Barack Obama policies. A vote for Pat Roberts is to stop them, win back the Senate, end the gridlock, and get our energy industry back on track.
Mr. Orman?
First, I think I need to make it clear once again that, as I've said, I believe Obama and Reid are part of the problem, but Senator, I think you're part of the problem too. And ultimately, I've said that if I win, I am not going to support either Harry Reid or Mitch McConnell for majority leader, because I believe they've both been far too partisan for far too long. And the senator can say that over and over again, but it doesn't make it so. I am the only person on the stage who actually has real experience in the energy industry. I ran a natural gas exploration and production company that produced natural gas out of coal bed methane. We were the first people to use, that industry was the first industry to use horizontal drilling to get at our natural gas resources, which we all know is a big part of the energy renaissance that we see in the United States today. I believe we can have a very similar energy renaissance right here in Kansas if we continue to support policies that make wind energy viable in this country. And so what I've talked about is we need to look at things like large-scale utility storage for energy so that we can turn wind energy into a real resource and have an economic boom for Kansas. I believe we need to support continued oil and gas development. I believe we need to continue to support a migration to some of these cleaner technologies as part of our portfolio. And in fact, I think we need to look, as someone who used to work for an electric company, I think we need to look at promoting fuels like CNG and LNG in electric vehicles, which when you look at the electric grid in Kansas City, there's lots of excess energy that we could use to power those vehicles at night. So I think there's a real opportunity for innovation and job creation in the energy sector, and I think we need to pursue it.
Most experts believe the federal Social Security program faces a funding shortfall in the future. In fact, recently the date was moved up. How and when this shortfall is addressed, which may potentially include changes in benefits, taxes, or even retirement age eligibility, could have a major impact on employees, employers, and workforce demographics. What are your views on how and when the Social Security program should be reformed? Mr. Orman, we'll start with you.
Well, first, what I've said throughout the campaign consistently is I think for those people who are nearing retirement, for those people over the age of 50 who have planned their retirement around Social Security, I don't believe we need to make any changes. For people who are younger, and particularly for people who earn more money, I believe it makes sense to say that we ultimately should get our Social Security checks a little later. And I think there's evidence to suggest that we can help create longevity in the Social Security Trust Fund by doing that. The other issue, though, that we need to address is the Social Security disability system. Right now, almost 20 cents out of every dollar that Social Security spends is spent on disability payments. The number of people on Social Security has gone up over 6 million since the turn of the century. Most of those people have musculoskeletal disorders that are very hard to determine whether or not they're actually occurring. I think the Social Security Disability Program is an important program. I think we need to protect it, but right now I think it's being abused. And I think one of the ways that we can protect the longevity of Social Security is to make sure those other components of the program, like the disability program, are being used properly.
Senator Roberts?
The Social Security program is financially secure to 2034. There have been, goodness knows, 3 or 4 commissions. All of those commissions pretty well come up with the same recommendations. But as you know, Social Security is the third rail of politics. The problem is that both parties really have not touched that. There is not a Social Security box behind the Speaker's chair or behind the acting presiding officer where the money is taken out of the General Treasury. And so we have to solve that, but I think we have enough time to come up with real good tax reform first. If we get the economy going, and we get the pro-job and the pro-growth policies that Republicans stand for and that we will do, that will not be boxed up with regards to Harry Reid. May I just repeat that the reason that the Senate is in gridlock hands is in one person's hands, that's Harry Reid. He only allowed the Democrats 7 amendments this whole past year because he doesn't want to vote on the tough issues. Social Security would certainly be one of them. And I want to go back to this situation that my opponent states where he will not tell you where he stands or who he will caucus with. So he's not going to vote for Mitch McConnell. We understand that. Now he says he's not going to vote for Harry Reid. That's going to be of interest to Harry Reid because he gave money to Harry Reid and voted for Harry Reid. He also voted for the president. He gave money to the president. He ran as a Democrat against me in 2008. He gave money to Hillary Clinton and Kansas Democrats. And so by deed and by campaign donation, he's a Democrat. Who will he vote for to lead the Senate? Who will he vote for? Or won't he vote for anybody? Just hand up a little sign and say, I'm present, I'm here. Who will he caucus with? What committees will he serve on? He's just one independent who's going to go look for people who has good ideas. That's rather ridiculous.
Our next question has to do with health care reform, the Affordable Care Act, and it's a specific question. Do you favor repeal or repair of the ACA? And if repair, how would you repair? Where would you start? Mr. Roberts, we'll start with you on this question.
I think you have to repeal this. Just this month, people are getting more increases in premiums, more people losing their insurance. The doctor-patient relationship is threatened. We have rationing boards in the waiting under Obamacare. Taxes with Obamacare are going to be $1 trillion. Many people are not even aware of the taxes that are involved in Obamacare. I voted against Obamacare, and I think it should be repealed, but I also think it should be replaced, and I think we should have a health care system that moves away from the goals of this administration. Barack Obama, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi all said Obamacare is the first step toward national health insurance. We don't want and don't need national health insurance. We need a system that is market-driven. We have health savings accounts, and a lot of things have to be restored. It's that doctor-patient relationship that really has to be restored. So I think we have to repeal it. We have to replace it. We have a considerable number of Republican ideas to do that, but first we have to win the Senate. Harry Reid will not. The House has passed 350 bills. As I said, the Senate is a place where good bills go to die. And so all of the repeal and the replace legislation passed by the House of Representatives and shared in many cases with many different senators has been stopped by Harry Reid. And unless you stop Harry Reid, the same thing is going to go on, because the President has indicated this is a referendum on his policies and his programs and his legacy. And if you consider the donations, and if you consider who he votes for, this man is a liberal Democrat. I don't know why you just can't come clean and be proud of it and say, I'm a liberal Democrat and I will vote with Harry Reid, or maybe Chuck Schumer is the next in line.
Mr. Orman?
First, I need to clear up one thing. The senator suggested I voted for Harry Reid. I want to make sure everyone knows I didn't commit voter fraud. I didn't go to Nevada and vote in that election. The senator also talks a lot about contributions, but some of the contributions he's failed to talk about are my contributions to Republicans. I actually gave money to Scott Brown in Massachusetts in 2010 precisely because he was the vote that was supposed to prevent the Affordable Care Act from becoming law. That's why I made that contribution. I have said from the beginning that I think the Affordable Care Act expanded a broken system. When asked the question, will you repeal the Affordable Care Act, what I've said is, I think that's a false choice. I think any senator who stands up here and tells you he's going to repeal the Affordable Care Act is ignoring the reality that President Obama will simply veto the bill. And so from my standpoint, what I say is, let's start talking about the real issue in health care. Let's start talking about health care affordability. We have a health care affordability crisis in this country. We had it before the Affordable Care Act. We have it today. For people like me who run businesses and like you know every year you try to decide what kind of raises you can give employees. Every year the first question you have to answer is, how high have my health care premiums gone? Last year in one of our businesses in Lenexa, we gave 2.5% raises. It would have been 4 or 4.5% if we didn't have to deal with the rising costs of health care. The reason we have a health care affordability crisis is because the incentives are all wrong. We pay for quantity and not for quality. And if we realign the incentives in health care, I think we can get affordable health care that's also very high quality, and that's what I think we need to be focused on.
The marketplace has become increasingly global, certainly challenging businesses to remain flexible and competitive in order to survive. So what are your views on wage and benefit mandates, including potentially increasing the federal minimum wage and penalties for outsourcing of jobs overseas? Mr. Orman, you'll lead us off on this question.
Well, you know, as a small business owner, I obviously have to deal with these issues every day. My father actually refers to this as the beehive of regulations. What he says is these mandates, any single one of them you can survive. They're like a bee sting, but the collective effect of all of them is like falling into a beehive. And so ultimately, I believe we are over-regulated, over-mandated in this country, which is one of the reasons we came out with our small business reform plan that was really intended to get at the issue of relaxing restrictions on Dodd-Frank, reviewing all regulations on a rolling 10-year basis. And actually, when I said that, someone said to me, well, that's going to be impossible to do. There's so many regulations. You know, how are they going to be able to do that? And I said, that's precisely my point. If it's impossible for the government to be able to review it every 10 years, 1/10 of them, how difficult do you think it is for industry to comply with them? So I definitely think we need to be smarter about that. And the other thing we talked about in our small business plan is we need, if we are going to regulate business, we need to do it much more efficiently. You know, my father's furniture store, he'll get visited by the Department of Transportation because he has trucks. He'll get visited by OSHA because he has a spray booth. He'll get visited by the Department of Labor because he has employees. And I think we can do a far better job of going ahead and consolidating that sort of regulation so that it's not as intrusive. In fact, when they look at the impact of regulations on small business, the average small business in America today now pays about $11,000 per employee complying with regulations. And I think that's a problem.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, the key is to get the regulatory reform bill through the Senate. I was one of the first senators to introduce a comprehensive regulatory reform bill. It took the President's executive order that said, we're going to take a look at all the regulations that have been promulgated to date and then all the regulations that you're going to do down the road, and we're going to put a cost-benefit standard at that, and if the cost outweighs the benefit, we shouldn't be doing it. The President said they were silly and counterproductive. I agreed with him. But Harry Reid wouldn't let us consider the bill. That's the problem, is the gridlock in Washington. You can give, everybody here knows about the regulatory overkill. I can't go to any place in Kansas or any section of our economy when we have not experienced regulatory overkill. So you walk in a room, somebody hands up a piece of paper, Senator, have you seen this regulation? Probably I have not. They didn't until Tuesday, and that's on a Wednesday, and we hand it to them, but we take it back to the office. It used to be you could go in and you could talk to the agencies and at least make a little sense. This isn't the case now. You have an agenda. You have a regulatory agenda by this administration where that person that you're talking to has an agenda, and you're not going to win that. And you may be fined first and ask questions later. That's why people think that many people have lost faith in their government, and that's because the government doesn't have any faith with the business community. They don't trust us. That's why you have to change this. But we can't do it when we have a president that stands up and says, this is a referendum on my policies and my programs. And he says that this is what the election is all about. And again, by word, by deed, by campaign donation, Scott Brown is one person. He voted for Obama. He ran as a Democrat in 2008. He gave to Hillary Clinton, Kansas Democrats, Harry Reid. This man is a liberal Democrat. He will say otherwise, but that's not the case.
Higher education, including universities, community colleges, and technical schools, are certainly fundamental to a well-educated, well-trained workforce to ensure businesses remain competitive. Much of the funding, of course, comes from state tuition and donations. But what do you see as the role of the federal government in higher education. Mr. Roberts, you'll lead us off.
Number one, I think the federal government should live up to what we promised with special education, more especially in our elementary schools and in our high schools. I think that amount of money that we provide now is somewhere around 12, 13%. It was promised it was going to be 40%. And that's going to be an awful tough job when we have the budget situation where we have a debt of $18 trillion. But I actually teamed up with a Democrat member of the Senate in insisting that when you put a mandate on any program by the federal government, we ought to pay for it. So that, in one area, is where I think the federal government can be of help. But I really believe in education, local control is best control, and that is because we have the knowledge and we have the hands-on experience. We don't need more federal mandates telling our kids how much to eat in the school lunch, or we don't need the mandates on education. No child left behind. If you want to get out of that, you have to get into more regulations. But just let me say again, I have a record of creating real jobs, and on the education votes that the NFIB scored and the Chamber of Commerce scored, that's who they endorsed. The same issues that you deal with, the same issues that I've talked with you about in Kansas and then also in Washington. That's why they endorsed me. They did not endorse my opponent. My opponent is very amorphous in regards to where he stands on the issues. And so that's why the Chamber and the NFIB endorsed me, and then also went on to say, I didn't say this, went on to say that my opponent is, in fact, by donation, by deed, by past experience, he wasn't independent when he ran against me in 2008, and he isn't now. So they defined him as a liberal Democrat. I know why he says he wants to be an independent. It's because if he says he's a liberal Democrat, you won't vote for him.
Mr. Orman?
I'd actually invite everybody to go to my website, ormanforsenate.com, and first look at our responses to all the issues and draw your own conclusions about who I am as a candidate. I have actually always been independent-minded. I've always been fiscally responsible and socially tolerant, but most importantly focused on solving problems. So I'd ask you to not listen to what you're hearing here today, but rather to do the work yourself and look at the website and draw your own conclusions. I want to address a couple other issues before we get to higher education, which I think is a very important issue. But first, Senator Roberts talks about the Senate being the problem. I agree the Senate is being run poorly. Harry Reid's running it like a dictatorship. But the House has similar problems. David Camp, the chairman of the House Committee on Taxation, put together a tax reform bill that his own chamber wouldn't even take up because it was a difficult issue. The Senate passed an immigration reform bill that 14 Republican senators agreed with. Senators, I will tell you, who agreed with my position on immigration, including guys like John McCain. The House wouldn't take that bill up. So both parties are to blame. Both chambers of Congress are acting in an overly political way. As it relates to higher education, I believe this is an example of a policy failure in our government. We spend over $100 billion a year on guaranteed student loans, tax credits, Hope scholarships, Pell Grants, all with the goal of making higher education more affordable, and yet we don't hold colleges and universities accountable for that public policy goal. I think we need to say to colleges and universities who get taxpayer money for that specific goal that you have to limit your rate increases to the rate of inflation in the general economy. Now, I'm a capitalist. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, but don't do it with taxpayer money.
Advice and consent is a key constitutional role of the Senate, and it's likely that vacancies will occur during your 6-year term in the Senate on a wide variety of positions that influence business and the economy and that require Senate confirmation. What are your views on the process? And do you have a particular litmus test or principles that will guide you in your confirmation vote? Mr. Orman, you'll start us off.
I look at confirmation votes the same way I look at hiring executives to run companies. You've got to ask some very basic questions about them. Number one, are they qualified to do the job they're being asked to do? Number two, does their history and track record suggest that they are thoughtful, reasonable, intelligent people who will continue to be thoughtful, reasonable, and intelligent in the future? But as a chief executive of a company, I also understand the need of chief executives to appoint their own team. And so I would be less inclined to turn down a candidate unless I really thought that that candidate for the job had some serious red flags, some questions in judgment that were real lapses in judgment, a lack of capabilities. But otherwise, I think if you approach it the way you would approach hiring an executive for one of your companies, that's the right standard. And at the end of the day, we sort of need to let chief executives, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, pick the team that they feel like they need to pick to run various cabinet agencies.
Mr. Roberts?
It was just this past session when Harry Reid and the Democrats broke the rules to change the rules, and rather than 60 votes on nominations and judges, it went down to 51. So they were able to ram through many of their nominations and judges on a 51-vote basis. The only way to stop that was a legislative maneuver, which I won't get into because it's too complex. But the first thing a Republican majority will do is to restore minority rights so that we get it right on nominations and judges. I would like to put, I don't have a litmus test, but I want people who are nominated either for nominations or judges, I want them to be for limited government. I don't want them to be legislating from the bench or from their position within some federal agency. And I would like for them to be conservative. Conservative from the standpoint that they are conservative in their view that they don't have any overreach with regards to their responsibilities. Now, how's that working out for us with regards to Harry Reid and Barack Obama? IRS, the Department of Health and Human Services, the EPA, I don't want to name names here, but all these people have an agenda. The Department of Interior. This is an incredible government that has an agenda as opposed to looking to the costs and the benefits. And the agenda fits the Obama-Reid agenda. And that's why this election is so important. A vote for Pat Roberts is a vote to achieve the Senate majority and put back the rules that we had before for 225 years. A vote for Greg Orman is to continue the Barack Obama and the Harry Reid agenda. It is really that simple.
Time to move now to closing statements. Each candidate will have 4 minutes. Our order continues. Senator Roberts, you will lead us off with a 4-minute closing statement.
The eyes of the nation are on Kansas. The rest of the country is counting on us to get it right this election. It will be up to us, to Kansas, to determine who will be in the majority in the United States Senate. It is up to Kansas to help restore a long overdue check on the Obama-Reid agenda. A Republican majority will repeal and replace Obamacare, stop the President and his allies from forcing amnesty on America. A Republican majority will bring common sense conservative principles back to our country. We will get the government off your back, lower your taxes, and help give you and your family freedom to pursue your dreams and those of your children and grandchildren. I am the only candidate in this race who can deliver that Republican majority, who will fight for Kansas values and fight for you. I'm a man of my word. The same cannot be said of my opponent. We don't know who my opponent really is. He won't tell us where he stands. He dodges questions, tries to take both sides of every issue. Trying to get Greg Orman's position on an issue, any issue, is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. So we have to look at what he has done. His record, and it's crystal clear. Greg Orman is no independent. He is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal Democrat by word, by deed, and by campaign donations. Elections determine the future of our country. Kansas needs someone in the Senate with conviction and a backbone. My opponent has neither. First, he says he's a Republican. Then he says he's a Democrat. Then just this year, he became an independent. Ladies and gentlemen, who and what will Greg Orman be next year? Do you really want to gamble our children and our grandchildren's future on a man with no convictions? Mr. Orman ran against me as a Democrat in 2008. He voted for Barack Obama. He has given thousands of dollars to the Kansas Democrat Party, Harry Reid, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama. That is not an independent. A vote for Greg Orman is a vote to hand over the future of Kansas and the country to Harry Reid and Barack Obama. Mr. Orman is pro-amnesty. He wants more government restrictions on the First and Second Amendment, if you can believe that, and he won't repeal Obamacare. That's not an independent. I voted against Obamacare every time, and I'll continue that fight. We must stop President Obama from implementing amnesty by yet another executive order. He's threatened to do that right after the election. We must secure our border, and we must respect the law. I will continue that fight. We need to create jobs and provide certainty for businesses with lower taxes and fewer regulations. I will do that. I have a strong record of delivering these conservative results, which again is why the U.S. Chamber, the same issues that we talk and meet with when you come to Washington, the same issues that I have talked with you when we meet with you here in Kansas, and the National Federation of Independent Business, also the same issues. They have endorsed me. Friends, my vision is our vision. But most of all, I will fight every waking minute to restore our faith in government. A government that governs, not rules. A government that is a partner, not an adversary. And a government that respects the vision of our founding fathers. Thank you. May God bless you and our great state and the United States of America.
Mr. Orman?
Thank you to the Johnson County Public Policy Council for the opportunity to be here with you today, and for everyone who took time to be here or listen at home. And thank you to my wife, Sybil, for her continuing love and support. You're all business people. You solve problems every day. And the way you solve problems is by looking at all the facts, considering the implications, applying logic and common sense, and then making a practical decision. And the decision we have in front of us today is a simple one. Do we want a continuation of what we've had in the past? Is the status quo acceptable? Are we solving problems? Is a government that behaves like two children fighting in the back seat of a driverless car what we want to hand off to future generations? If it is, I'm not your guy. But if you want to try something new, if you believe we are at a point in time in our country when we have to send a message, then I'm asking for your vote. We're the country that put a man on the moon, that harvested the power of the atom, that took computers that used to fill a room and put them on the head of a pin. I believe that country and those people can solve any problem when they put their minds together and work together. But we can't accomplish any of that if we continue to accept that there are only two paths forward. I'm running as an independent to reject the false choices that the two-party system has presented us with. I believe we can have affordable and high-quality health care. I believe we can have secure borders and a humane immigration policy. I believe we can have a good economy and a good environment. And I believe that we can have a new American century. But we won't get there if we keep electing partisans instead of problem solvers. Change can be scary, but what frightens me is more of the same. What frightens me is a health care system that's running out of control. What frightens me is a federal budget that seems to grow regardless of what happens in Washington. What frightens me is two parties who seem more interested in seeing the other party fail than working together so that our country can succeed. I believe this election is an opportunity for Kansans to send a message to politicians of both parties that you can't hide behind your party label, that if you don't set your differences aside and start solving problems, we will send new leaders there who will. This is an opportunity for Kansans to say there's a new way forward and that path travels through Kansas. This election is an opportunity to show the nation what's right with Kansas. I look forward to the opportunity to start a real conversation in Washington to solve our problems. You can read more about my vision at ormanforsenate.com. Today I'm asking for your vote on November 4th to finally get Washington back into the business of solving problems for all Americans, regardless of party label. Thank you.